And one of the conversations that Terrance and I used to have is, how does, the Timewave purports to measure or predict the ingression of novelty into the world, into the continuum. Is novelty something that happens in a punctate way, or is it something that happens in a gradual way? And this is the question. Terrance was he was an advocate of the punctate theory of novelty, big events, right? Like the detonation of the atomic bomb over Hiroshima, or 9/11, or, some of these things. Like, these are huge events. They have an instantaneous global impact. But where is the real novel event? Is it when they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, or was it when they first tested it in the desert in New Mexico, or was it when they first triggered the first fission reaction in Oppenheimer's group in Chicago in the 30s, or was it when Einstein thought of the equation? Where was the real novel event, that triggered all this, or was it more of an accumulation of these kinds of things that led to it? And I'm more of a gradualist. I tend to think that, novelty does not erupt into reality. It doesn't erupt into the world. It sort of oozes into the world. It gradually builds up, with notable exceptions, things like
asteroids and comets.
Asteroids and comets. That's about the only one I can think of. But yeah, that would be an unexpected and very novel event, and not something that we really want to happen. But I can't think of anything else, or anything else on that, that would have that impact. Maybe the super volcanoes exploding in Yellowstone. I'm not sure. These global geological or cosmic events, they could be quite abrupt, and they would certainly, qualify as novel events. But Terrance talked about the novelty and kind of this transition, the end of history, and this transition into a post-historical state, as something that is going to change everything, but it could be more subtle than that. I think that, for example, this recent report out of CERN, this report on the faster than light neutrinos and all that, that is a huge discovery. If that is true, then that basically demolishes physics, right? It demolishes the last 150 years foundations of physics. On the surface, nothing has changed. We're still here. Everything is still pretty much the same. But in terms of the way we think about the world and the way we understand the world, if that is shown to hold up, we're going to have to completely revise all our assumptions about the way reality is. And maybe that is the singularity right there. Maybe that's all, you know what I mean? Maybe that's it. Maybe that's to say, well, yeah, Terrance was right in some sense, even though, it's not going to lead to global catastrophe, or it's not going to lead to sudden evolution of consciousness to some higher level. But over time, it will change the way people understand the world.
Well, yeah, but a lot of the examples that you're giving, to some extent, they're relative to the observer, our mindset in the Western world.
Right.
For example, someone in March living next to the Japanese reactor, their life was suddenly changed, and you could say that reached maximum novelty for them personally, it being involved in it. It's so many of these preconceived ideas are relative to the participant or observer. And
of course, we all experience ultimately our own singularity, right? We all die. So
Right.
That's our personal singularity. Whether global culture is going to experience a collective singularity, I don't know. I mean, it's okay to say we don't know.
Yeah.
I think of a lot of scenarios that are to be wished for, that are a little more desirable than global catastrophe. I mean, there's always the hope that, the aliens will show up, the brotherly aliens, and will, elect not to wipe us out. Maybe will help us get our act together. I mean, that would be a good thing. Evangelicals hope that Jesus will show up in his fiery chariot and smite the wicked and save the righteous. The problem is that these things, in a way, are an excuse to not do anything, right?
Yeah.
All we have to do is sit around and wait for the aliens to show up, or wait for Jesus to come, or wait for the asteroid. In the meantime, it's falling apart around us, I mean, we don't need to wait till 2012. We need to get cracking,
Definitely.
right now.
Right now.
Yeah, to change consciousness and ultimately to try to slow down what's happening to our planet. I mean, we're changing things much too fast. I mean, it may be we've already reached the tipping point. And again, that may be the novel event, but will we even know it when we reach it? Or will we be able to say, 50 or 75 years from now, back in, the first decade of the 20th century, we crossed the threshold where, we cannot arrest these processes that are leading to the destabilization of the biosphere, of the global ecosystem. In retrospect, we may recognize it, but we probably won't recognize it when it happens.
No, I hope we can sit around the campfire and discuss that with some brew down the road.
Indeed.
I just, back on the Timewave Zero, were there some aspects of the I Ching that inspired it? Was it long hours of pounding out code on the keyboard, based on a derivative of the Mandelbrot set that came up with the fractal nature of time, or was it a vision quest? Or
no, all that came later. I mean, at the time, this was like 1971. I mean, we didn't know anything about fractals. It was not even part of,
right.
mainstream consciousness at that time. I don't know when the Mandelbrot set first.
I think it was the 80s, but
it was the 80s. And at the time, we didn't say the fractal nature of time. I mean, that came later, when that became a term that you could apply to it. I mean, the way it started out really was kind of on a personal level, because Terrance was, we'd been into the I Ching, like a lot of people were back then. We were deeply into Jung, and Jung brought the I Ching, to the world. And we cast the I Ching. A lot of people did. Terrance was, he had a big copy of the, I forget the primary translator, but he had a big copy of the I Ching, which he carried with him everywhere he went on all his travels. And he would religiously, or, religiously in the sense of regularly, every 14 days on the new moon and the full moon, he would cast the I Ching, right? So that was a practice that he had. So he was into it. So when we did the experiment at La Chorrera, one of the things that he was trying to do was relate the date of the experiment to other significant events in our personal lives. So he started counting backwards and forwards, right, from March 4th, 1971, counting backwards. Well, if you counted backwards a certain number, and I think it wasn't 64 days. It was like 100. It was like twice that. It was a multiple of that. If you counted back 128 days from that date, it turns out that was the date that our mother died. And if you counted forward a similar number, that was Terrance's birthday, and on November 16th. And so he was trying to kind of plot out all of these different personal cycles. And I don't know why he was. I mean, I wasn't paying attention because I was off cruising the cosmos in my own, particular version of this thing. But he was really trying to nail down where does that date fit in line with our personal lives, and then with history, and then with even larger cycles like geological cycles, and through a series of looking at these different cycles of 64 and multiples of 64, like it turns out if you make a macro hexagram, which is 6 times 64, is 384. Well, 384 happens to be a perfect 13-month lunar calendar. And you can use that as a 13-month calendar. And I think that may actually be what Terrance did without knowing about it, without really knowing it. He rediscovered that, in fact, the I Ching was a calendar. And could be, at least it could be used that way if you treated it in this mathematical way. If he had left it at that and said, I've rediscovered an ancient Chinese calendar, a lot of people would say, well, that's interesting. Next, but he took it to the next step, and he said, not only is it a calendar, but it actually describes the structure of time. And what was news about that was, what, time has a structure? Who knew? And so that was an interesting idea, that time, actually, it's not just a place where you put events. It has a texture, and the nature of, the sort of boundaries of time, if you will, determine to a certain extent what can happen, so it sounds like determinism, and it, to a certain extent it is. I mean, it abrogates free will, right? Because if the structure of time determines what happens, then free will goes out the window. But he got around that by saying, well, yes, but it determines what can happen, but it determines within certain boundary conditions. Within those boundary conditions, there's some degree of freedom, So that was kind of how he formulated it. But there are big problems with the time wave. The biggest problem, in my opinion, is there's no objective way to interpret it. There's no quantitative way to interpret it. The only person that can interpret it is Terrance. So it's entirely based on sort of his subjective assessment of what is important in history. Somebody else may look at it from a completely different way and say, no, this is completely off. So that's the problem, and actually we used to discuss this a lot when he was working on it. And I used to say, you've got to develop a mathematically rigorous way, if you can, to say, what is a novel event? I mean, how can I say event A is, 10 times more novel than event B? That's what was missing from the time wave. There was no way to measure novelty. It was a great concept, no way to quantify it.